For 15 years, she adjusted, smiled, and nodded, hiding something that slowly reshaped her world. It wasn't pride or denial alone. It was a deeper fear many seniors recognize. The fear of being seen differently, treated differently, or quietly set aside. She did not notice the change all at once. Hearing loss rarely arrives as a single moment you can point to and name. It came quietly, woven into ordinary days, disguised as background noise or other people speaking too softly. At first, it was easy to explain away. Restaurants were loud. Television audio wasn't mixed the way it used to be. People mumbled more than they once did. These explanations felt reasonable, almost comforting, because they placed the problem outside herself. In those early years, nothing felt urgent. She could still follow conversations if she concentrated. She leaned in slightly without realizing it. She watched faces more closely, catching meaning from expressions and timing rather than sound alone. When she missed a word, she filled it in using context. This kind of quiet adjustment became second nature. It felt clever, even resourceful, like solving a small puzzle each time someone spoke. She did not talk about it because it did not yet feel like something worth talking about. Admitting difficulty felt unnecessary when she could still manage. And managing became the goal. Each successful day reinforced the belief that silence was working. As long as she could keep up, there was no need to explain, no need to draw attention to herself, no need to change how others saw her. Over time, those small adjustments multiplied. The television volume crept upward, slowly enough that it did not feel excessive to her. She chose seats strategically, always closer to whoever spoke the most. She avoided sitting with her back to the room, preferring angles where she could see faces clearly. Phone calls became shorter, more transactional. She nodded often, smiled at the right moments, laughed when others laughed. These gestures helped her blend in, helped her avoid the embarrassment of asking someone to repeat themselves yet again. Silence became a kind of shield, not silence in the literal sense, but the silence of not naming what was happening. By not saying it out loud, she could pretend it was temporary or minor or simply part of the environment. Words have weight. Once spoken, they make things real. She was not ready for that reality. There was also a sense of responsibility tied to her quiet coping. She did not want to inconvenience others. Asking people to repeat themselves slowed conversations, disrupted flow, shifted attention. She worried about being seen as difficult or demanding or old. It felt easier to shoulder the effort herself than to ask the world to adjust around her. As the years passed, the effort increased. What once required mild concentration now demanded constant vigilance. Conversations became work. Social gatherings felt like performances where she had to stay alert, reading cues, filling gaps, staying one step ahead of confusion. By the end of an evening, she felt drained in a way she could not easily explain. It wasn't physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of constant compensation. Still, she said nothing. The habit of coping in silence had become deeply ingrained. Speaking up felt like failure, as if all those years of managing would suddenly be undone by one admission. She had built an identity around being capable, self-sufficient, composed. Acknowledging hearing loss felt like cracking that image. There were moments when the strain showed through, a response that didn't quite fit the question, a laugh that came a beat too late, a misunderstanding that led to brief awkwardness. She brushed these off quickly, often blaming herself for not paying enough attention. Rarely did she consider that the problem might be her hearing rather than her focus. Silence also allowed her to avoid decisions. Naming the loss would lead to questions. What next? Tests, devices, changes, explanations. Each step carried emotional weight. By staying quiet, she postponed all of that. Postponement felt like control. In private moments, she sometimes acknowledged the truth to herself. Late at night, when the house was still, she noticed how certain sounds had faded. The clock ticking in the next room, the subtle hum of appliances. These absences felt unsettling, but she did not dwell on them. Daylight brought distraction. Life moved on. The longer she coped in silence, the more normal it felt. It became her baseline. She did not think of herself as someone with hearing loss. She thought of herself as someone who just needed things a bit clearer, a bit louder, a bit slower. These distinctions mattered to her. They preserved a sense of continuity with who she had always been. Yet beneath that continuity, something was shifting. Silence, once a strategy, was becoming a barrier. Each unspoken adjustment widened the gap between her experience and everyone else's. She was present but not fully participating. Engaged but always calculating. The cost was subtle, spread thinly over years, but it was real. She did not yet see that cost clearly. At this stage, silence still felt protective. It kept her world manageable. It kept difficult conversations at bay. It allowed her to move through life without explaining herself. And for a long time, that felt like strength. But silence has a way of changing shape over time. What begins as a coping mechanism can slowly turn into isolation. What feels like control can become confinement. She had not reached that realization yet. For now, she was simply doing what she had learned to do best, adapting quietly, hoping that managing alone was enough. What kept her silent for so long was not only habit, but a deeply held belief about independence. She had grown up valuing self-reliance. You handled your own problems. You adapted. You didn't ask for help unless you absolutely had to. That belief had served her well throughout life. It helped her raise a family, manage responsibilities, and navigate difficult seasons without leaning too heavily on anyone else. So when her hearing began to change, independence became the lens through which she interpreted everything. Managing alone felt like proof that she was still capable, still herself, still strong. As long as she could adjust quietly, she told herself, there was no reason to involve others. Hiding the loss felt like dignity. It allowed her to show up as she always had, without explanations or accommodations. She feared that once people knew, they would treat her differently. Speak more slowly, raise their voices unnecessarily, look at her with concern instead of ease. Those imagined reactions felt heavier than the loss itself. There was also pride involved, though she would not have named it that way at the time. Pride in managing. Pride in not becoming that person who needed things repeated or clarified. Pride in staying invisible in her effort. Each successful interaction reinforced the idea that concealment equaled competence. Independence, in her mind, meant not burdening others. She worried that acknowledging her hearing loss would make conversations awkward or require patience she didn't feel entitled to ask for. It seemed kinder to absorb the strain herself than to redistribute it. What she did not realize was that this choice slowly shifted the balance of connection. Conversations remained smooth on the surface, but they became less genuine underneath. Over time, independence began to take on a quieter, lonelier form. She still attended gatherings, still smiled and nodded, still participated, but she rarely initiated deeper conversations anymore. It was easier to stay on the edges, where missing a word or two didn't matter as much. She began choosing situations where listening was optional rather than essential. This wasn't a conscious withdrawal. It happened gradually, guided by comfort. Loud restaurants became less appealing. Group conversations felt unpredictable. She gravitated toward familiar people and familiar settings, where she could anticipate speech patterns and fill in gaps more easily. Her world narrowed gently, almost invisibly. She told herself, This was simply preference, that she was becoming more selective with age. And perhaps some of that was true. But beneath those preferences was a growing avoidance of situations where her coping strategies might fail. Independence had quietly transformed into isolation, though she would not have used that word. The hardest part was that no one else could see the effort she was making. From the outside, she seemed unchanged, capable, engaged, present. The cost of hiding was paid internally, in concentration and fatigue. By the end of social interactions, she often felt depleted, even when nothing particularly demanding had occurred. Still, she held tightly to the idea that managing alone was better than risking vulnerability. Vulnerability felt like exposure. It felt like inviting judgment, pity, or misunderstanding. Independence, even strained independence, felt safer. There were moments when she considered speaking up. A comment made in passing, a repeated misunderstanding, a flash of frustration when she realized she had missed something important. In those moments, the words almost formed. But habit pulled her back. Silence was familiar. Silence was controlled. She also believed that naming the loss would make it permanent. As long as it remained unspoken, it felt flexible, negotiable. Saying it out loud would give it shape and weight. She wasn't ready for that acknowledgement. What she didn't yet see was how independence, when taken too far, can become a wall rather than a foundation. True independence allows choice. It allows support when needed, but the version she was living required constant vigilance and self-denial. It asked her to be strong at the expense of ease. As the years went on, the gap between how independent she appeared and how supported she felt grew wider. She was carrying more than she needed to, quietly proving something to no one in particular. And that quiet proving came at a cost she was only beginning to sense. The emotional weight of hiding was accumulating, even if she could not yet name it. What started as a practical adjustment had become an emotional burden, and slowly that burden began to show itself, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle shifts in how she felt about connection, conversation, and herself. Those shifts would eventually lead her to confront something she had avoided for years, the emotional cost no one else could see. As time passed, the effort of hiding began to shape her inner world more than she expected. The hearing loss itself was not what exhausted her most. It was the constant vigilance, the need to stay alert, to anticipate words before they were spoken, to read faces and gestures with careful attention. Every conversation required calculation. Every interaction carried risk. She became skilled at compensating. She watched lips closely. She leaned into familiar phrases. She laughed when others laughed, even when she wasn't entirely sure why. These skills allowed her to move through social spaces without drawing attention, but they demanded energy. By the end of a simple gathering, she often felt more tired than she could explain. Fatigue settled in quietly, not the kind that comes from physical exertion, but the mental weariness of always being on. Listening was no longer passive. It was work. And because that work was invisible, she rarely felt justified in acknowledging how draining it had become. There were moments of embarrassment she carried alone, a response that didn't quite fit the question, a laugh that arrived a beat too late, a misunderstanding that shifted the tone of a conversation without anyone fully noticing why. Each moment passed quickly, but it left a mark. Over time, these small misalignments chipped away at her confidence. She began to doubt herself, not just her hearing, but her place in conversations. She spoke less, not because she had nothing to say, but because speaking required certainty. Certainty that she had understood correctly. Certainty that she wouldn't need something repeated. Silence felt safer than correction. Loneliness did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through small choices. Choosing not to answer the phone when the connection felt unclear. sitting quietly instead of asking someone to repeat themselves, letting conversations move on without her input. Each choice felt reasonable in the moment. Together they created distance. Even with people she loved, she felt a growing sense of separation. She was present, but not fully included. She caught parts of stories, but not always the emotional nuance. Jokes lost their timing. Subtle shifts in tone were missed. These gaps made her feel slightly out of step, as though she were watching life through a pane of glass. What hurt most was that others didn't know. They assumed she was simply quieter now, more reserved, perhaps tired. No one saw the effort behind her silence. No one realized that her withdrawal was not disinterest, but protection. She also carried a quiet grief for the ease she had lost. Conversations used to flow without effort. Now they required strategy. She missed the simplicity of listening without strain, of responding without hesitation. That loss was difficult to name, because it felt selfish to mourn something that seemed so small compared to other hardships people faced. But loss is not measured by comparison. It is measured by impact, and this loss was reshaping how she moved through the world. As the emotional cost grew, she noticed changes in herself. She was more hesitant in group settings, less spontaneous, more cautious. Social situations that once brought joy now carried tension. She began declining invitations, telling herself she preferred quieter evenings. In truth, she preferred predictability. The isolation that formed was subtle but real. She was surrounded by people, yet often felt alone, not because others were absent, but because she was working so hard to keep a part of herself hidden. That kind of concealment creates distance even in close company. At times she wondered what it would be like to simply say the words, to explain, to ask for patience. The thought brought both relief and fear. Relief at the possibility of ease, fear of how she might be perceived. She worried about becoming a burden, about slowing others down, about being seen as difficult or demanding. These fears kept her silent even as the emotional cost increased. What she did not yet understand was that the cost of hiding was greater than the cost of honesty. But that realization takes time. It often arrives not through crisis, but through accumulation, through the slow recognition that carrying everything alone is not the same as being strong. That recognition was forming quietly in her, shaped by years of effort and fatigue. And it prepared her for the moment when awareness would finally replace fear not with drama, but with clarity. The moment that changed her understanding did not arrive with urgency or alarm. There was no sharp confrontation, no dramatic realization that demanded immediate action. Instead, it came gently, almost unnoticed at first, to an ordinary interaction that lingered longer than it should have. She was with someone she trusted, someone who spoke without hurry. The setting was familiar, the conversation unremarkable. At some point, a sentence passed her by. She responded slightly off course, and the pause that followed felt different. Not awkward, just revealing. The other person didn't correct her immediately. They waited, then softly repeated what they had said, slower this time, with care rather than correction. In that small space, something shifted. She realized that nothing terrible had happened. There was no judgment, no impatience, just an adjustment. And that adjustment had made understanding possible again. The simplicity of that moment unsettled her. For years she had carried the belief that needing repetition would disrupt connection, that it would burden others or draw attention she didn't want. Yet here was proof that a small accommodation could restore clarity without harm. Later, she reflected on how fear had shaped her assumptions. Fear had told her that acknowledgement would lead to embarrassment, that revealing her hearing loss would make her smaller. But this moment suggested something else entirely. It suggested that honesty could create space rather than shrink it. Awareness arrived quietly after that. She began noticing how often she guessed instead of asking, how often she filled in blanks that didn't belong to her, how much energy that guessing required. She realized that much of her fatigue came not from hearing loss itself, but from managing it alone. There was a tenderness in this realization, not regret but understanding. She saw that her silence had been an attempt at self-protection, not avoidance. She had been trying to preserve dignity in the only way she knew how. Once she allowed herself to see this clearly, fear loosened its grip. Hearing loss stopped feeling like a secret that needed guarding. It became a condition that could be acknowledged, adapted to, and lived with openly. She didn't announce it to everyone at once. Awareness doesn't demand grand gestures. It asks for small, honest steps. She began by saying simple things. I might need that repeated. I hear better when I can see your face. Each statement felt vulnerable at first, but also grounding. What surprised her was how naturally others responded. Most adjusted without hesitation. Some thanked her for saying something. A few admitted their own quiet challenges. The conversations didn't end, they deepened. Fear had told her that awareness would isolate her. Experience showed her the opposite. The shift reframed everything. Hearing loss was no longer something to hide. It was something to navigate. And navigation requires information, not secrecy. With awareness replacing fear, she felt a new steadiness emerge. She was no longer bracing herself in every interaction. She could listen without guessing, speak without second-guessing, be present without performing. That presence opened the door to something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Genuine connection. As honesty entered her life in small, deliberate ways, relationships began to change. And through those changes, she discovered that what she had feared losing, respect, dignity, belonging, had never been at risk at all.